Welcome, boys and girls. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time of day that I have you right now. Today, I'm going to be giving you kind of a virtual lecture regarding the Roman Republic and discussing the ins and outs of the early Republic and how it began to truly transform Rome itself. But first things first, we need to talk about the people of Rome. Now, in and around 509 BCE, the nobles of Rome began to rebel against the sitting king. If you remember from the other day, the sitting king during this time was a very, very harsh individual. He was punishing people that were part of his own government and sentencing them to death. And eventually, the nobles rose up against them and overthrew them. The nobles decide to establish a new form of government, something that had never really been done before. What they established was something called a republic. A republic is nothing more than the people itself electing a leader in order to govern them. This is altogether different from a democracy in which we've already discussed when we were talking about Athens last unit. Once the republic was actually created, there were challenges from outsides for quite a while. Shortly after the Republic formed, war broke out across the entire region. This was a war that waged on and off for the next 50 years. Over this course of time, it destroyed many lives and a lot of property all across Rome. And when you consider the amount of devastation that can happen during war and the cost to replenish everything that had been destroyed, this is going to be pretty costly. During difficult times of war, a lot of times what would happen is that the people in Rome, meaning the government itself, the republic, would choose what was known as a dictator. Now, the term dictator these days means a lot of different things than what it meant back then. Now, I know this is going to sound really, really strange and probably goes against a lot of things that we've already kind of discussed, but dictators ruled with almost absolute power. Now, I'd need you guys to understand that dictators back then did have limits, though. They were given powers in order to make laws and could basically do as they pleased. But a lot of times what needed to happen, the dictator needed to check with the Senate as well as the courts to make sure that what they were doing was right, just, and fair. Another thing that happened with dictators is that dictators could only stay in power for 6 months before they had to give their power back to the republic itself. Now, it's not to say that in all cases dictators did this. Down the line, we'll talk about dictators that remained in power and tried to become dictator for life. One of the most famous dictators during this era was a man by the name of Cincinnatus. Now, Cincinnatus was a very interesting individual. He spent a good chunk of his life within the military, and then he retired and became a farmer. Now, eventually, during a time of war, Rome is losing against an enemy, and they have been wiped out. And Rome basically has its back against the wall. And so the Republic decides to choose Cincinnatus as their leader for dictator. They choose him in order to defend the city against this enemy. Cincinnatus was such a brilliant leader and tactician that he quickly defeated the enemies of the Republic within a very, very short amount of time. But the thing that made Cincinnatus great was that he was not eager to hold on to power. He respected that power. And so very, very quickly, he gives his power back to the Republic and ceases being dictator. The reason we talk about Cincinnatus these days is that, he's admired for his abilities as well as his loyalty to the Republic and what it takes to maintain that Republic. Within Rome itself, there were also challenges. So not only are they fighting enemies outside, but there's also some fighting inside that's taking place. Enemy armies, again, were not the only threat. There's a little bit of a threat within Rome itself. Now, at this point in time, Roman society is broken into two separate classes. The first class is called the plebeians. Plebeians were basically the common people of Rome itself, the people that we consider to be peasants, traders, craftspeople. So if you look at the image on the left, those would basically be the people that are illustrated on the right there. And then there are the patricians. The patricians are the powerful nobles within Rome itself, clearly illustrated there on the left. Now there is a third class within Rome, and that would be the slaves, and we'll talk about them on another day. What begins to happen here is that plebeians begin calling for changes within the government. And there's a good reason for this. Plebeians outnumber patricians within the city itself. And I mean greatly outnumber them. Now, because the government is lacking any type of representation of the plebeians, they really kind of get upset because they're the bulk of the population. Why don't they have more of a say with what's going on? And so they're viewing what the government is doing as very, very unfair. So in 494 BCE, the plebeians decide to form their own council and elect their own officials. And the patricians really don't like what's going on here. I mean, it would be like if normal everyday citizens here in the United States just decide to form their own council and make their own rules. So the patricians were feeling that Rome would truly fall apart if the plebeians were given this kind of a format within Rome itself. So the patricians who were running the government at the time decide to put their heads together, and they decide to change the government. Prior to this point, there were only two basic classes of government. There was basically the magistrates and what they dubbed the Senate. But with the inclusion of the plebeians in this entire process, it changes everything. So after the conflict with the plebeians, the government began to change from top to bottom. It was broken into three main parts, otherwise known as a tripartite government. The first part of the government was called the magistrates. The second part, the Senate. And the third part was comprised of assemblies and tribunes. So let's talk about the first part of the government, the magistrates. The magistrates were made up of elected officials. These individuals were elected by the people of Rome itself, both patricians and plebeians. Now, within the magistrates themselves, there are many, many, many minor magistrates, people that hold just city positions. But amongst all of the magistrates, there are the two most powerful, people that are known as consuls. Consuls were leaders that were elected each year. So they only had a term of 1 year before they were being replaced. And it's the same thing with all other minor magistrates. They serve for 1 year. Now, the role of the consul was to run the city, lead the army, and they basically judged court cases. They had a lot of responsibility on their hands. There were two consuls because the people of Rome feared that no one person should be too powerful. Otherwise, that power is going to go to their head and, they're going to rule with an iron fist. Now, the thing with consuls is they almost kind of acted like dictators because they almost had that absolute power, but they were kept in check by the rest of the government itself. The second part of the government was known as the Senate. The Senate itself was complex. It was intricate, and it was big. Now, for the most part, the Senate was a council of wealthy and powerful Romans. And for the most part, the bulk of the Senate were patricians, at least for a good while. Now, the job of the Senate itself was to advise city leaders known as magistrates. Now, before the Republic, it was the Senate's job to actually advise Rome's kings. Roman senators held office for life. That seems like a very, very strange position to have for life. But, I mean, different time, different era. If you look at the way that our government is run, the people that are basically brought into the Supreme Court, our justices, hold their position for life. Now, the Senate itself is comprised of over 300 members. As I said before, most of these members were patricians, but later on plebeians were entered into the Senate, and most of those plebeians were very, very wealthy merchants. In fact, there were times where plebeian merchants were just as rich as a lot of the patrician nobles. Many, many times, magistrates became senators after completing their term as a magistrate. The Senate ends up becoming extraordinarily powerful late in the Republic itself. The reason for this is that they were able to gain influence over magistrates, and eventually the senators take control of all of Rome's finances or money. Finally, the third part of government was known as the Assemblies and tribunes. Now, the job of the assemblies and tribunes was to basically protect the common people, which was the bulk of the population of Rome itself. There are two branches of this particular form of government, which is the assemblies and the tribunes. Now, the assemblies, both patricians and plebeians took part in. The primary job was to elect magistrates who ran the city. Another role that they had was to declare war or peace. Third thing to kind of know about the assemblies is that there were no term limits. You know, when you think about magistrates, they serve for 1 year. When you think about senators, they serve for life. But assemblies were open to all within Rome that were citizens, both patricians and plebeians. The tribunes, though, the tribunes were a group of elected officials elected strictly by the plebeians, the common people. There were only 10 people selected to be tribunes. These 10 people, their role, their job was to protect the rights of the common people, to make sure the common everyday Roman was being treated fairly. They governed by majority rule, which meant that, when they were voting on things to happen, if the majority of the group voted one way, that was how things were governed. One thing to also note about the tribunes is that they actually had a lot of power. The power that they had was veto power. Veto power means to prohibit or to forbid, and they were able to veto powers against the magistrates, the people that were basically running the city. And they could actually veto the consuls if it was truly a violation of the common people itself. Very, very similarly to the magistrates, tribunes only remained in office for 1 year before they were placed with somebody else. Now, what I would like you guys to do after this slideshow is I would like you to have your recorder make a copy of the government chart that is in your agenda. Once that is shared out to you all, you are then to work on that chart together as a group. If you read the directions carefully, you'll read that each one of you is in charge of a certain part of that chart. Once that chart is completed, the recorder needs to submit it for the group itself. After that, please refer to your agenda for what you are to do next. If you finish the agenda today, you are free to head back and finish your IXLs or to work on any additional work from any other classes.